Class, we'll do the first reading, which is Unit 1, India's foreign policy, or India at the end of the Cold War and emerging power. So there are two readings here. One is about a kind of a summary of India from 1947 to 1991 in the sense of foreign policy. There can be other readings in it. I've just given one. We can discuss more. The other, of course, is about the idea of emerging power. So the first reading I use is explaining 60 years of India's foreign policy, which is written by Sumit Ganguly, who is a professor of political science at Indiana University. Old South Asia hand. Is a lot of writing on India's foreign policy, India, Pakistan, range of issues. I just recently saw he's also edited the Oxford Handbook of Indian Politics. I don't know why, but sure he's done that. Good for him. And Manjeet Pardesi, who's I think an upcoming scholar, must be teaching somewhere, I don't really know. So what they do in this piece is they make a survey of India's foreign policy from 1947 till 2009 when this article is written. And in a sense what they do is they divide India's foreign policy into three periods. There's what we would call periodization. And after they periodize it, they explain, the policies. In a manner of speaking, they talk about why certain policies were chosen. They also talk about how to evaluate certain policies. Were they successful? Were they unsuccessful? And the kind of template that they have after a foreign policy is about the country. Foreign policy is about its interaction with the world. As I said earlier, we'll divide the international environment into a global environment. What are the big guys doing, and into a regional environment. I mean, after all, we live with China and Pakistan are our neighbors. So, domestically also we look at India. What is India? Nehru's India, Indira Gandhi's India, Narendra Modi's India, coalition government India. You do realize there will be a different response of India based on decision making, based on the stability of political power. So, the sources of foreign policy, according to this article, can be reduced to three levels: a systemic level, regional level, and the national level. And then we look at the three periods. The three broad periods they talk about is 1947 to 1962, 1962 to 1991, and 1991 onwards. Now, of course, you do realize when you write a paper, it's always, sometimes you want to study India-Pakistan relations. Let's say some of you want to do if I do a written assignment. Now, of course, you can study India-Pakistan from 1947 onwards, but, it'll be at best 10 marks an assignment. So, it makes sense for you to limit the India-Pakistan relations to certain periods. I'll just look at Nehru's period. I'll look at maybe Indira Gandhi's period. I'll look at maybe the coalition government, 1989 to 2014. We are back, but you can periodize it. It makes it more, just for a paper, 10 marks in a semester, a BA student, that is more handleable. In the end, the idea of research is you go into a certain depth and try to answer some puzzle. You try to answer some questions which we do not know why. There's no point in answering questions you already know. So, whenever students do research, we try to tell, can you periodize it? So, that's one logic that make it, that it's doable. After all, I want to research why humankind behaves the way it does. You'll say, wow, you must be a genius. You are interested in blah, blah, blah. But can I do it? That's more important. Can you do it? So, you'll say that, okay, instead of studying this very obvious attribute of all of mankind, can you, maybe break it down into a task, something you'll do in this semester, something you can do in next semester, something you can do in next semester. You do realize, also as BA students, you can end up dividing maybe a larger, curiosity query you have into smaller studies, and at the end of your BA, you'll possibly have 4 papers on the topic, And you can improve that. You understand what I'm trying to say. I'll leave that there. So we periodize it. But how you periodize a study in foreign policy matters. Everywhere dating matters. That if you are going to look at European history from 1789 all the way till 1945, you do realize you can divide them into different eras, different periods. But the choice of the starting date and the choice of, how you define the period matters. Similarly, to cut all these digressions short is when we define periods in Indian foreign policy, we generally say there is one period which is the Nehru period. One logic from 47 to 62 is that Nehru was the Prime Minister of India. Now we know in hindsight, and a number of research has been carried out, Nehru was a very, very dominant actor in foreign policy. In fact, many meetings where, Parliament has committees on foreign affairs. Now the idea of this committee is that you will meet the Minister of External Affairs and you will question him. Our Parliament is a check and balance on the government. As Narendra Modi is just discovering. For 2 terms he didn't know that. No, but if you teach political science, you will understand the Parliament is a check and balance on the Prime Minister, on the Minister of External Affairs. So in these parliamentary committee meetings of Nehru, instead of the parliamentarians asking questions to Nehru, usually Nehru would educate them about foreign policy. Because his exposure to international politics, his traveling around, his engagement with the subject was quite dramatic. And it is important to remember that while Indians were part of British colonial administration since 1919, there were no Indians. Indians had no experience of foreign affairs. The British did not involve Indians in the practice of foreign affairs or security. So, independent India in 1947 had no history of engagement on foreign policy. So we came with that kind of, as we say, tabula rasa, blank slate. But the point I was making was that Nehru was very dominant. So 1, Nehru was the Prime Minister. 2, Nehru was very dominant. 3, essentially we say 1947 to 1962, Nehru dies in 64. But we are still dating it to 62 because Nehruvian policy, as we talk about it, we'll talk about the nature of it, essentially are, hit hard by the 1962 India-China war. In fact, if you are thinking of a watershed moment in India as a global actor, it is 1962. It is far more important than the 71 war, it is far more important than the 74 nuclear test, than the 1998 nuclear test. The most dramatic effects of India's foreign policy and security policies occur in 1962. So, when you choose a period in your study, you have to be able to justify why this period, okay? The second period is, of course, 1962 to 1991. One is, India has suffered that great psychological pushback from China. All the grandstanding of Nehru on the United Nations and global sphere, a leader who was elected, suffered a very, very dramatic kind of retreat. And, people say that 1962 this began. You see that the kind of foreign policy Nehru followed from 47 to 62 very dramatically altered. Even while Nehru was alive in one way, there's a military modernization along with the help of the United States and UK after the China war. Very antithetical to what Nehru's policy was. So while Nehru was alive only, he started that. But what he did was 62 to 1991 is that essentially India moves away from this idealism that we associate with Nehru, and it doesn't remove, it doesn't get rid of Nehruvian policy. It keeps Nehruvian rhetoric, but slowly policy becomes more and more pragmatic. From 1990, and you would know why we have used 1991. One very dramatic period is 47 to 62 and 62 to 1991. 1991 because of the Cold War. Because, 1962 we got hit regionally. It was seen as a loss of face for Prime Minister Nehru. He had been an advocate of Hindi chili bhai bhai for a long time. Till today people eat and get elected by Daddy Nehru, you know that. So, regionally and nationally, India was hit. But in 1991, of course, at global level there were changes. The Soviet Union, India's supposedly good, bad weather friend or friend in need or big brother, whatever you want to call it, ceased to exist. So India, which had been dependent on a Soviet support in the UN Security Council, whenever matters were discussed, or whenever India felt threatened by China or United States, as in 71, in a manner of speaking. So that structure of the systemic politics altered. And the third phase is beginning in 1991 after the Cold War. So one is, of course, Soviet Union doesn't exist. Two is India starts economic reforms. Three is that there is only one superpower in the world, the United States, and it sees India as an enemy, and India sees it as, my God, you got stuck with the only bully in town. So it is said that policies after 1991 become extremely pragmatic. No grandstanding, no idealism at all. So these are the three periods that we look at. So what you need to remember, this is a survey of India's foreign policy from 47 to present day. This article, of course, is from 2009. We'll update it. The second is that we divide this into three periods: 47 to 62, 62 to 91, 91 to present. We say that we can evaluate. We look at the origin of these policies in a systemic level, globally, in a regional level, what is happening around South Asia, and nationally, all three levels, right? And in this, essentially, the very short argument, just to summarize it, is they make that Nehru ignored systemic constraints, they say. That Nehru ignored the fact that India was militarily and economically a poor country while looking for a very large global role. In the end, you're a big global actor if you're powerful, right? I mean, we would think that is common sense, right? I mean, imagine Fiji trying to talk big at the United Nations and giving gyan to all leaders. You'll be like, hey, go away. You'll say something like that. I'm here talking in power terms. You will be dismissive of Fiji. So they say Nehru's India played that kind of role, that despite lack of economic power and military power, it played a disproportionate and an influential role in world politics in this period. Of course, it might be that Indians are exaggerating the role Nehru played. So, we'll take that with a pinch of salt. But it is quite true if you look at the accounts of, even foreign scholars, that India did have a disproportionate role in the world, disproportionate to its actual economic strength and military power. Think of India in 1947, a poor country, diverse country, democracy, little military power, grandstanding of the United Nations. Anyway, so the paper argues that Nehru ignored systemic constraints to pursue an ideational foreign policy with disastrous consequences. The disastrous consequences are, of course, the 1962 war. And this ideational foreign policy essentially left India unprepared to cope with serious threat of the People's Republic of China. I mean, that's the only point they make. And he says that after this threat from the People's Republic of China, which leads to a short border war. It's a short war, it's a border war, and China doesn't really occupy Indian territory. I think Sumit Ganguly, and which I have to, he says that China attacked India, came to a certain extent, but they declared ceasefire and withdrew, but they kept 14,000 square kilometers. The point I'm making here is, as far as I know, when the war broke out in October 1962, China attacked India, it's like came, slapped India and pulled back. That's what I know. There was no occupation of Indian territory in October 1962. Sumit Ganguly, this article says, there's a footnote where he's citing himself, genius scholars. He says that China did not leave 14,000 square kilometers. I'll check that again. But what I think is he's referring to Aksai Chin. That occupation was much before the war. Please try and understand what I'm trying to get to. I'll clarify this. When Sumit Ganguly and Manjit Pardesi in this article state that China attacked India and withdrew, except they did not leave 14,000 square kilometer, I believe they are not referring to occupation in this war, they are referring to occupation which occurred much earlier. In fact, the border problem began when Indians discovered that the Chinese had already occupied Aksai Chin in the 50s. Which is why, Nehru, when he was under attack in the parliament, there was a right-wing party called the Swatantra Party, P.L. Modi, etc. They wanted basically pro-American policies, foreign direct investment, against communism. So P.L. Modi made the point that, China has taken over this land. So Nehru, as a defensive measure, he responded that nothing grows in Aksai Chin. And you know what P.L. Modi said? He says, Panditji, nothing grows on your head also. Should we cut it off? I don't know if that was considered parliamentary then. I'm sure it was expunged on the orders of the speaker also. But the point I'm making is, this is what Sumit Ganguly says. What I know is that China came, it entered Arunachal Pradesh, fought in Ladakh, blah blah blah, and it withdrew back, status quo. We'll check that. So usually this is the point which is often made, that Nehru's pursuit of ideational foreign policy had disastrous consequences because it left India unprepared to cope with the serious threat of the People's Republic of China in 1962. But after 1962, India embarked on a self-help strategy. One of the key attributes of Nehru's foreign policy was that India does not want to be involved in bloc politics, because we had just won freedom. Freedom was extremely important to us. We thought by participating in this Cold War politics of USA versus USSR, we'll soon be dominated again and our independence might reduce. One. Two, they believed that if they participated in these bloc politics or alliance politics, they believed that they would be enticed or they would get kind of trapped into, military conflicts, and for that you have to spend on the military. Nehru did not want to increase military expenditure after a point, because he thought economic development of India was the key to India's progress. And the military alliances system, history students, please remember, when you study about the rise of modern Europe, or if you study European history, you realize World War I, and World War I is explained often by many historians as a war. People say, was the war accidental? Historiography says the war was accidental, World War I. They say that war was inevitable because of the system of alliances. The third group of historians say that war was deliberate. The Germans provoked the war. So there was ample liberal literature, Nehru is a liberal. The idea, when you define a liberal, it might be a dirty word for you, but liberal means rational. Liberal essentially means that you believe human beings can work together by cooperating with each other. Liberal essentially means that, we can use learning and knowledge to better human lives, the Enlightenment project. The idea of liberalism is that. So one belief of liberalism was that international wars or the world wars took place because of alliance politics. That once alliance politics, you have A versus B, B versus C, then, if A versus B and B versus C, then A and C become allies. So these were the understanding of Nehru, that, lessons of history, enlightenment, his education in England, also the influence of, what are they called? What kind of socialist was Nehru? Named after his teacher in LSE. Just Google what kind of socialist was Nehru. There's a specific term, my God. So, anybody, can you just Google what kind of liberal was Nehru? No, there's I think he based on one of these professors. Nehru's socialism. Fabian socialist. So, and he had, so to make that point, I'll drop that point there. So this is what the paper argues. And this is essentially generic understanding of India's foreign policy. Then Nehru began like that, and 62 there was this thakka laga types, very filmy kind of language you can use. And then India said, oh, we can't do all that nonsense that during Nehru's time you were playing this larger role, you have to become more and more pragmatic. So one way is like, it's quite but this is generic understanding of India's foreign policy beginning from 1947 onwards. And it becomes, it's reiterated because of Indira Gandhi's personality. That Nehru was this socialist at large, he was a world citizen, respected by and friendly to, Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, was very close to Nehru, Ho Chi Minh, various, leaders from the African countries, Western leaders. He was a man well-read, in a manner of speaking, as people say that he was a white man in India, he was a liberal Indian, or he was a westernized Indian, or an anglicized Indian. I don't believe all that. I don't think he might have been anglicized. There are many people anglicized today. It doesn't matter if you follow these. I believe he was essentially he was just an English-speaking one who was cosmopolitan and comfortable around the world. Because of his privileged background, because of his education, also because of his reading. After all, a lot of Indian leaders studied abroad. A lot of them studied abroad. None of them had these attributes that Nehru had. Sure, maybe you say that Motilal had come out, a lot of money, Allahabad mein, big house, blah, blah, blah. All that is there. So, if you think of that cosmopolitan, very international statesman, then you are contrasting Indira Gandhi was extremely uncomfortable abroad, lacking in even education. I think she didn't pass a school education, if I am correct. While Nehru we associate with idealism, Indira we associate with realism. That she was more masculine than the men in the party in terms of dominating the Congress. So you get it. You can contrast this first Nehruvian period with what Indira was. Nehru very comfortable, meeting people, well-read, aware of international affairs. Indira did not have that exposure to international affairs. She obviously wasn't well-read. And her politics is different, right? When you think of the 1971 war, when you think of, we'll forget domestic politics. We'll just think of 1971 war, we'll think of 1974 nuclear test, we'll think of the merger of Sikkim with India in 1974. Just international events. That she used power in a very, very different way. So Indira was so different from her father that it also underscores the difference between these first points and second point. First period and second period if you have it. But I don't want to get ahead of, how the reading lays out the argument. But essentially that's the larger point. There is also a book, Nehru's foreign policy is of course well written, well covered. Indira Gandhi's foreign policy often is, you rarely find books on it. So there's V.P. Dutt who has, so his chapters are based on Prime Minister wise, Nehru's foreign policy, Indira Gandhi's foreign policy, Rajiv Gandhi's, Narasimha Rao's, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But there is a book by one of my professors, Professor Surjit Mansingh. It's called, I think it's called the Indira Gandhi Years. Terrific study. Today she teaches at American University. She's very old now. She was a retired diplomat who joined JNU as a professor. Wonderful classes. So as far as I know, so there are a lot of biographies of Indira Gandhi. You realize that. Journalists, many people have written, Tariq Ali. So they do cover her foreign policy years, but if you're looking at a scholarly examination of Indira Gandhi's foreign policy, only Surjit Mansingh's book is there. So if you're interested in that, you'll find that on Internet Archive. Possibly there on LibGen also, but it's there on Internet Archive. It might be there in our library. We have a good old library. Maybe the latest books are not there, but some of the books from earlier eras, it's a great place to check. So, the paper essentially argues that Nehru ignored the systemic constraints and pursued an independent foreign policy with disastrous consequence. What is the disaster? Essentially 1962, and after that India embarked on a self-help strategy, which is why 1947 to 1962 is Nehru's idealism, 1962 to 1991, they say, is Nehruvian rhetoric continued. The language, Nehru's foreign policy use is the same language of grandstanding, but foreign policy became more and more pragmatic. Think of 1971 war. That India, which talked of Mahatma Gandhi and Lord Buddha and Mahavira Jain, waiting for a reason to start a war with Pakistan so that they can reduce Pakistan into half. And you do realize India did not start the war. A lot of refugees started coming into India because of the atrocities of Razakars. You've been following it, right? What is happening there? And I think Sheikh Hasina is a corner. Maybe 2-3 years they might hold on to power, but Sheikh Hasina's government is increasingly going to become more and more, difficult to work with, and they'll suppress all protest movements as the disproportionate force. If you look at the videos of what happened in Bangladesh, the police are driving their armored vehicles into people. It's bizarre. Anyway, I'll skip that. So, refugees are coming into India. Indira Gandhi starts making this argument that lots of refugees are coming, will be destabilized if this continues. Pakistan should resolve the problem. Pakistan gives a reason for India to enter the war. They attack in Kashmir. That is when India enters the war. But of course, before India enters the war, India has already signed a treaty with Britain. Just before the war, I think I forget which month. Let me see if I have it written. India signs a treaty with the Soviet Union in 71 only, but much earlier. The war, of course, the 1971 war takes place in December. After winter has started, the snow is capped, the Chinese can't do much. The rains have subsided. Genius of a campaign. I don't have much interest in military history, but I wonder if it's used in military schools as a case study. You do realize Bengal, Bangladesh, similar terrain and the amount of rain, low rain, delta country. If you go to war in Bangladesh during rainy season, you will be caught. Your tanks will be caught. And tanks were the mainstay of the war, right? So they waited for the monsoon. They waited for Puja to be over, October, November. Being patient. They waited for the snows, they had just think about how well planned it was. So that's another contrast for you. And you would wonder that would Nehru ji kya karte hai? It's like a moment when what would Nehru do in a situation like that? Please understand that India's, when Nehru is the Prime Minister of India, India's engagement with Pakistan are entirely different because they were part of the same country. The refugee problem is still there. Kashmir dispute happened, so there is still an intimacy between India and Pakistan. As I said, till 1965, roads from India are going to Pakistan, power lines from India are going to Pakistan. It's crazy. Our separation didn't happen in 47, it began in 47. It took the 1965 war to snap power lines, to close roads. And of course, as we come to more and more of our contemporary time, it becomes worse. We feel they are another people, we are another people. So, this is the generic argument the article makes, and this agrees with most literature in the period. Though you might have some disagreement where people say that when often when you call somebody an idealist, it's also like abusing somebody. In a sense, that if you are accusing him of idealist, you are telling you have no idea of reality. And that's often used, I don't know, I think it's a very societal linkage, society kind of understanding of what idealism means. And even if they are not aware of this debate in foreign policy, they'll say, in Hindi they say, aap to aadarshwadi baat kar rahe hain. So, but the idea when they put you on that pedestal, to tell you have no idea of, they say, what is ground reality. It's almost like a kind of opposition. So there are arguments which say that no, Nehru was an idealist, but he was very aware of grounded reality. And it was his awareness of grounded reality which recognized that China would be a threat to India, that he went about trying to cultivate China. One argument is Nehru was an idealist. Panditji didn't know what he was doing because he was a badi batein he was doing and he was not aware of ground reality. And that is why he's attacked. And the range of politicians from the opposition attack him based on that simplistic understanding. There are revisionist study which says that Nehruji was very aware of reality. In 1947, Nehruji aware that there is reality. What is reality? That there is this giant called China. China is powerful. China can be a threat to India. So if you as a Prime Minister realize that in 1947, you can say very simplistically, you can do two things. One is you build a huge army so that the Chinese can do nothing to you. Two, you say, hey, I'll be friends with China so that I don't even need an army. So Nehru goes out of his way to cultivate China. Now, of course, Nehru's cultivation of China is not, only if he could look into his mind when he took those decisions. But partly his cultivation of China was the fact that India and China are both Asian powers, that India and China were both colonized countries, that at last these larger Asian countries which had dominated the world in the period prior to colonialism, both these giants would rise together. Both these giants would rise together, and therefore it was in their interest to work together, to cooperate together. Nehru's first ambassador to China, K.M. Panikkar, goes when China is still not communist. This man was a genius. When China, the civil war is already going on, and the nationalists, Kuomintang, if you know your Chinese history, so China is an empire till about 1911, 1912, 1914. The Qing dynasty, and the Qing dynasty then collapses, and it's a period of unrest in China. The Chinese Republic is proclaimed, but it's very, kind of a weak period. Within 15 years, Japan attacks and conquers all of China. So part of the liberation movement in China is, of course, from the empire to how to create a country, the struggle which was already going on. Part of it has to fight the Japanese to liberate themselves, because Japan colonized China between 1934, if I am not wrong. And in the fight against Japan, there are two main Chinese factions. One is the communist, one is the nationalist. Communist Party of China and the Nationalist Party, which is KMT, Kuomintang, or GMD also, depending on what kind of translation you are using. Communist Party of China, Mao Zedong. The Nationalist Party is Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek nationalist. And you have to realize this is occurring during Second World War. During Second World War, Japan is an Axis power, so the Allies are battling Japan, right? Across the Pacific Ocean. Across the Pacific Ocean, the Allied US, British are battling, in the Pacific, the Americans are doing it. They use the nuclear weapon in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Imphal, Imphal and Kohima are big battles between the British and the Japanese. Big, huge battles. The Battle of Imphal and the Battle of Kohima. So part of the same war with Northeast India, where the British and the Americans are supplying Chinese. So they fly planes from Dibrugarh to Kunming, which is just a 1-hour flight. It's called Over the Hump in the Himalayas, to supply Chinese forces who are fighting the Japanese. They are also trying to build what is called, you might have heard, the Stilwell Road or the Burma Road. They're trying to build a road from Ledo in Assam to Kunming, so that they can do air transfer, but if they get a road supply, they can supply Chinese troops more and more things. So part of the Western condition to China is that please fight the Japanese together, Chinese and communist and nationalist. But the nature of civil war struggle in China was that sometimes they combined united front for the Japanese, sometimes they fought each other. So China's liberation is part of the World War II. And as Japan is defeated, the communists and the nationalists are at civil war. So the first government after the defeat of Japan in China is the nationalist government. K.M. Panikkar, who is the author of many books, goes to China, and he is the Indian ambassador to Chiang Kai-shek's government in Beijing. But the civil war is such that the communists push the nationalists, and the nationalists retreat to Taiwan. Taiwan is an island. So Second World War is over, Cold War has already begun. The communists push the nationalists withdraw from Beijing and they retreat to Taiwan. So now that the People's Republic of China is proclaimed, then K.M. Panikkar becomes India's ambassador to Communist China. The name of his book is called In Two China. He's got a book. It will be available in a library. In Two Chinas, TWO. He's also got a book on the Indian Ocean as a strategic zone. Scholarly man. So with the nationalist withdrawal to Taiwan, it was seen that the communists conquer the mainland. People's Republic of China is established in 1949. The communists take over Taiwan and they call themselves the Republic of China on Taiwan. Both of them claim to be the real China. And this period, this is seen as just a lull in the fighting. Soon, it is believed that the nationalists, of course with the help of the Americans, will regain strength and attack mainland China and defeat the communists. But that doesn't occur because the Cold War freezes power configuration. Soviet Union becomes allied to China. So if the nationalists with the help of the Americans attack mainland, the Soviets would come into the war and it is a Cold War. So this is the context. So one was China was a large country, and of course the Qing dynasty, the last Chinese empire, included Xinjiang and Tibet. So they are already, when they are not colonized, they are already making claims that this is a territory of China, including Taiwan, including Tibet and including Xinjiang. And the Tibetans protest. Part of it in 1914, there is a Shimla Agreement of 1914. The Tibetans now want to assert independence, and they come to what is called the Shimla Agreement, where the British British India sits, the Tibetans sit, and the Chinese representative to the Dalai Lama's court sits, or Dalai Lama's government sits. And what do? They accept what is called the McMahon Line, where Taiwan becomes a part of India. McMahon Line is essentially the line in the eastern sector. The Tibetans agree and sign even if they are losing territory. Taiwan was a part of Tibet. They are losing territory, but they signed the agreement because they have been recognized by the greatest power, the British. The Chinese representative disagrees. He says, no, we don't agree to this. Part of the conflict between India and China dates back to this agreement. Taiwan and some parts of Arunachal Pradesh become a part of British India because the British are trying to secure India's borders, frontier especially, where they meet China, where they meet Russia, because there are three large empires. There is the British Indian Empire, there is the Chinese Empire, and there is the Russian Empire. If you look at the borders of it, the Chinese Empire and the British Empire of course meet, but not in the way you imagine today. But there is no meeting between the Russian Empire and the Indian Empire, British Indian Empire. So the British create a part of Afghanistan so that what is today Central Asia has no border with India, Pakistan. If you look at your map, it's in Afghanistan, it's called Wakhan Corridor. The idea was to buffer British Indian territory from Central Asian territory. So India does not, even united J&K, the entire state as shown in our maps, we don't have it. That doesn't have a border with Central Asia. That borders with the Wakhan Corridor. The Wakhan Corridor is a thin corridor of land created by the British, to say this is Afghanistan, the Chinese territory, Russian territory doesn't touch British Indian territory. At some places it's only 10 kilometers wide. So Chinese claims rest on the fact that this agreement was, done by a colonial power, Shimla Agreement in 1914, that the Chinese did not agree to it, and they say that all Tibetan territory is Chinese territory because Tibet is a part of China. The British had significant rights in Tibet. They wanted to open Tibet for trade. They wanted to ensure that nobody used Tibet against India. There was a fear. This is part of what is called the Great Game. The competition for inner Asia between Russian Empire, Chinese Empire and the British Indian Empire. They were constantly worried who is politicking with Tibet. Because they thought Tibet, if Chinese or the Russians could use Tibet so well, then they could make British India vulnerable. And of course, India was a jewel in the crown, right? So, the Chinese lay claim to the territory that we call Indian territories, of the Arunachal Pradesh, what they call southern Tibet, essentially because they believe or they claim that Tibet is a part of China and all Tibetan territory is part of Chinese territory, and this territory in 1914 was done by a colonial power. And this is not to say that this makes the Chinese right. After all, what the Chinese are claiming are also what is, they are claiming what was a historical empire. By that yardstick, the Tibetans would claim that many times we've ruled you. But at the heart of India-China dispute is essentially the status of Tibet. So, Nehru was aware, in fact, the first few steps, the Chinese, after the People's Republic of China, the first few steps, British India had policing rights in Tibet. They maintained telegraph lines. They had an agent in Lhasa. Nehru withdraws all that. British had a lot of extraterritorial rights in Tibet, which Nehru withdraws because he believes these are colonial policy, and he did not want to provoke China. So Nehru was aware that this was a giant state which was claiming Tibet, and once they claimed and took over Tibet, China would be a neighbor of India. So one of his argument was that he would fight and battle for Tibet's autonomy within China. Rather than say that Tibet is not a part of China, Nehru decided to take the approach that the Tibetans should have cultural rights, autonomy within China. So while not confronting China, being Chinese friend, we will battle for this. And Nehru was aware that China's liberation happened, it was unlike Indian liberation, which was largely a peaceful movement led by the Congress. Chinese liberation was war fighting. The Communist Party of China had been formed in 1922. With what? The Russian Revolution just 5 years ago. And they fought a very, very hard battle. In fact, if you read the history, this is a reference I've got, that even Stalin didn't think the Communist Chinese would actually succeed. And he was also dealing with Chiang Kai-shek for a long time. But they were very able leaders, the Chinese Communist Party leaders. They were also very, very grounded. In fact, there's a lot of heroism written about it. I don't know how much of it is true. I'm sure some of it is true. There's this period of a long march when they're defeated in a battle and they have to run away and they march. I can't remember exactly. Just let me Google that. Long March, I think. That episode is called. Long March is a 10,000 kilometer historic trek of the Chinese communists, which resulted in the relocation of the communist revolutionary base from southeastern China to northwestern China, and the emergence of Mao Zedong as an undisputed party leader. So basically, Mao led his troops on a long march to escape the prosecution of Nationalist Party and the forces of Chiang Kai-shek. So I'm just trying to say, just peppering it is that this was a ideologically very motivated force, and it was used to battles. Communist Party, the organ, the PLA was part of it. The nature of the Chinese state today is the nature of how the Communist Party of China grew up or evolved and took power. So you would say, hey, why is China strong and India weak? Precisely because their entire liberation came militarily. The liberation of of China was a uphill struggle for the communists. So they were in certain ways a battle-ready force. Even if we had the same level of arms, after all, it's not only guns which fight arms, it's also morale, how you're organized, what kind of exposure you've had. India had largely, following the British tradition, a professional army. Right, compared to the Chinese army, which was in certain ways ideological, which was cadre-based army. You do realize the difference between, let's say, a professional Western army than a communist force. In Nepal, when the Maoists agreed to a peace sharing agreement with the political parties, the Maoist was an army, right? It's a war fighting force. People's Group. If they come to power, you would realize they're battle hardened people. So in Nepal, part of the peace agreement which the UN was involved in was that there would be rehabilitation of these Maoists. And you know what the Nepal Maoists were doing? They were constantly increasing the number of their cadre. Because the idea was, once these people are rehabilitated, where will they be rehabilitated? In the Nepalese army. So they thought that if they could keep inflating the numbers, the Nepalese army would largely be a Maoist army. You're getting that point of ideologically motivated, the structure of communist parties are such. So, and Maoist parties, right? The name also comes from there. So, there were real reasons for Nehru to fear that China would pose a formidable challenge to India. And it is on these grounds, I would think it is awareness which Nehru adopts a policy that we need to befriend China. Part of it is national solidarity, part of it is also trying to kind of bridge the gap between the Western bloc and the communist bloc. Because the Western bloc went about trying to attack China in different forums. That UN Security Council, there is a seat at the UN Security Council for China. People's Republic of China did not sit on it till 1971. The Republic of China on Taiwan, the Nationalist Party, sat on the UN seat till 1971. In fact, there is an episode where India is offered a seat at the UN Security Council. We don't know how real the offer was, but people, again, crazy right-wing scholars say, look what a fool Nehru was. But Nehru doesn't get pulled into that. He says that, you should first let China, let the real China sit on the table. So, there are revisionist views which says that Nehru's policies were grounded in reality. And if he was, the accusation is that he was unreal about behavior from the Chinese, right? So that is why I am focusing on the Chinese here. But of course, if you look at India in 1947, so we'll evaluate it systematically. At the global level, the Cold War had just begun, and both the USSR and USA was not very interested in India. And because the superpowers were not very interested in India, it gave India room for maneuver globally. At the regional level, there was an understanding, or maybe there is an understanding today. I don't think it was an understanding in 1947 that the PRC or China would in certain ways be this kind of neighbor of India. I don't think so. In hindsight, it might be easy to say, of course, hame pata tha. Chini aayenge and they'll bully us. I don't think so. First, because there was no sense of China as a neighbor in India. There are a lot of similarities between China and India, but there is no history of neighborly relationship. You can talk about neighborly relationship with Central Asia, You can talk about neighborly relation with Southeast Asia. You can talk about neighborly relationship with the Arab world and the African world, East Coast. But you can't talk about neighborly relations with China because China was distant. Our neighbor was Tibet and Xinjiang, if there were any neighbors. So, in hindsight, because of what happened later, people might say, of course, India was at a disadvantage because of China. But in 1947, there was no such understanding, if you read the literature of the time. In fact, Indians were obsessed with Pakistan and partition. But Sumit Ganguly says that, but I'm just saying that we don't need to accept anything. Right? These are scholarly writing, you can contest it. At some later stage in time, you can make the point. So, systematically, the Cold War had started. Both USSR and USA was not very interested in India. It gave India room for maneuver. At the regional level, they say that the PRC and distribution of power was such that significant security threat to India. And why was PRC powerful? Because China was in a civil war for the last 20 years, and the People's Republic of China, cadre-based army, which was fighting for 22 years, or fighting since 1922. Well, we had largely a peaceful national movement. While China's, let's say, national movement leaders, they were all battle-hardened soldiers, from Deng Xiaoping to Mao, not everybody, but many of them. At the national level, what is happening? Of course, India had independence, freedom, and because we were being free after 200 years, 300 years, Indian elite or Indian masses privileged the concept of national autonomy. Because the memories of colonial rule were so recent, there was a desire to maintain the greatest possible independence as much as possible, especially in the conduct of foreign policy. And he says that public opinion of the time would find any deference to external powers intolerable. And Indian leadership was very, very sensitive to this. So, part of the understanding at the national level was that India has to stay out of the Cold War. Part of the understanding of this time was that India's policies have to be anti-imperialist. Part of the understanding was that we need to maintain and protect our newfound independence and still participate in global politics. And Nehru was the architect of this policy. He was, of course, a Western liberal, as you would understand it, Fabian socialist, but he was deeply skeptical of the United States, according to Sumit Ganguly. But he admired the quickness with which the Soviets had kind of generated industrialization. Russia is quite the backwater in Europe. If you look at European history, it was largely a peasant society. If you also read communist writing, Marx is hardly talking about Soviet Union. He's talking about the rise of communist societies from industrial societies, not from agricultural societies. So, of course, Soviet Union, Tsar's Russia undergoes some kind of industrialization, late 19th century, etc. But it's not really a Western European society. So they had achieved, Soviets after coming to power, had achieved quite significant success at industrialization with their planning process. And Nehru was an admirer of that. So he did not want, and of course, he did not generically, we pointed to Nehru's person, but India did not want to get involved in Cold War blocs because it would embroil India and direct critical resources from economic development, towards military preparedness, etc. Cold War participation in certain ways would also reduce possibly Indian independence. So, 1947 to 1962, there are three key features that characterize Indian foreign policy. One is that India played a significant role in multilateral institutions like the United Nations, and different kind of organizations, but largely the UN. And India was a very, very critical proponent of the non-aligned movement or non-aligned foreign policy. That India played a significant role in multilateral institutions like the United Nations. That India was a critical proponent of the non-aligned movement. And as leader of the non-aligned movement, India made significant contributions towards decolonization. So these are the three key features of foreign policy, India's foreign policy during this period of 47 to 62. Yes? That India, as the leader of NAM, made significant contributions towards decolonization. So 3 points: that India had a very important role in United Nations, India was a critical proponent of NAM, and that India made significant contributions towards decolonization. So if you look at it at the global level, India actually during this period tries to diffuse Cold War tensions in number of contexts, regional contexts like the Korean War, but also in functional context like the role of nuclear weapons. So India was one of the early proponents of a nuclear test ban treaty. In fact, India and Ireland introduced a draft for a nuclear test ban treaty as early as 1952. Of course, the first treaty on nuclear test ban was signed in 1961. It's called the Partial Test Ban Treaty. But the draft was first introduced in 1952. This points out to the idea, or this is a manifestation, that India had interest in foraging a particular kind of global order. That India had an interest in forging, building, creating a particular kind of global order. And this is a key attribute of Nehru. What was this global order? That we would reduce as much as possible with our policies the use of force in international affairs. Because it totally dovetailed with these domestic requirements that we do not want to invest in military. So if you are not investing in military, how will you be secure? By making the use of force in international politics illegal and hobbling it. Please understand that. It's not like Nehru did not invest in military and sat on his chair and was just, flirting with who? Edwina, and smoking cigarettes and doing yoga and playing cricket. I love all this imagery of Nehru that crops up when Narendra Modi tries to compete with him. So he does yoga and there's Nehru doing yoga, right? In shorts he's doing a full headstand. Narendra Modi keeps talking of yoga. Have you ever seen him doing headstand? How many of you do yoga? Hey, what happened? Baba Ramdev has been going at it for like unending years, but none of you do yoga. There's International Yoga Day. Pradhan Mantri gave you Man Ki Baat, does yoga. But can Pradhan Mantri Modi do headstand? And can that yogi do yoga? The yogi also not do yoga. You've seen him struggle to do yoga, right? So yeah. But I think Pradhan Mantri might keep talking of yoga, but he can't do yoga. He just does very easy asanas, like lying on an armchair. Have you seen any photo? If he can do it, there is a photo. You do know that. Prime Minister Modi loves the camera. So if he can do the headstand, there would be a photo. But I don't think we've seen Modi do headstand, have we? Nehru does this headstand. I was like, wow. And of course, I might have seen the picture earlier through books and all, but he never paid attention to prime ministers doing all these crazy nonsense things. But Modi made it all relevant. I think he does a headstand, then he also plays cricket with proper pads and all. Huh? So, he wasn't just resting in his armchair. While he was not investing in India's military, he was trying. The thrust of his policies was to forge a global order which would hobble the use of force in international affairs. Part of it is, of course, you can think of the nuclear draft treaty. The second was, of course, India's role in the United Nations peacekeeping operations. So India is very significantly involved in UN peacekeeping operation as well as in the peaceful resolution of regional disputes. India is involved in the International Control Commission in Vietnam. India is a key member of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission in Korea. India is making a significant force contribution in the UN peacekeeping operation in Belgian Congo. And India, all during this time, please remember Vietnam, Korea, Belgian Congo, India is a tireless campaigner to bring about decolonization. Yeah, 60s, yeah, but that's also, that hits India a little different. Because the Suez crisis coincides with, I think, the Soviet invasion of Hungary. And India pretends that's an internal matter of Soviet Union. Nehru pretends. So it's quite fascinating. So globally, India is trying to diffuse Cold War tensions in a number of regional and functional contexts. So Indian diplomacy discussed this issue, decolonization, at the international fora and non-aligned movement. I think I'll maybe stop here. Do you have any questions? Thursday I can maybe, but we can kind of, a lot of these things are not discussed in Sumit Ganguly, but they'll be relevant when we discuss India, China. They'll be relevant when we discuss India and US. They'll be relevant when we discuss India and Pakistan. Yes.
So how China got its independence in 1949, but after that there were multiple critics of Mao's government, how his government in China, but how is influencing all the countries like in Korea, North Korea, because he himself was motivated by Mao, and after 1949.
Yeah, the Communist Party had linkages across. That kind of linkages, if you realize all Southeast Asian countries, think of, we had one Communist Party, right? CPI. What happens in 1962? One part says we got nothing to do with China, we are independent of China. The other party says that we will have something to do with China. So there was what we would call fraternal links between communist parties all over the world. And Mao, Chinese Communist Party supported communist parties everywhere: Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, everywhere. And Mao was a huge inspiration. His writings on power, his writing on politics, the kind of methods, and you have to understand this also as an age of societies just being free of direct colonialism. And China's challenge to the West was seen as, something worth admiring. So, fraternal links within the party, ideological, in fact, a lot of, if you look at all movements around this time, whether you're looking at the Mizo movement, NSCN, they're all socialist movements. And they all are, supported directly, indirectly, ideologically by the Chinese communists. All across, if you think of the different ethnicities fighting the Burmese state, the Kachins, the Chains, the Sans, everybody is socialist in this period. It is all a result of the kind of politics of that time.